Welcome to Mythosium, the channel where we take the complex mechanisms that shape human perception and translate them into explanations anyone can understand. Today, we're exploring a world of illusions that deceive not the eyes, but the ears. These auditory illusions reveal how the brain interprets sound, how it constructs reality from vibrations in the air, and how easily those interpretations can drift away from objective truth. When most people think of illusions, they imagine visual tricks, like straight lines that appear curved, or two shapes that look different even though they're identical. But hearing is no less vulnerable to misinterpretation. In fact, the auditory system must constantly fill in information, predict patterns, and reorganize chaotic noise into meaningful signals. This creates enormous opportunity for the brain to be fooled. Unlike vision, which can rely on stable spatial reference, hearing is a temporal sense. It unfolds across time. Every moment of sound depends on what comes before and after it. The brain must continuously integrate new information, and that integration process opens the door to illusions, sounds that seem to change pitch even when they don't, voices that appear to say words that aren't there, and tones that seem to rise forever without ever getting higher. To understand why auditory illusions work, we need to start with the building blocks of sound. A pure tone, a single frequency, is extremely rare in everyday life. Most natural and artificial sounds are made of multiple frequencies layered together. Each frequency vibrates at a particular speed, measured in hertz. When combined, the mixture creates a unique pattern called timbre, which is why two instruments can play the same note and still sound distinct. For example, imagine a tone with a fundamental frequency at 100 hertz. On its own, this frequency feels low and smooth, but most real-world notes include a whole series of overtones at precise multiples, 200 hertz, 300 hertz, 400 hertz, and so on. These harmonics blend into a sound that the brain interprets as a single musical pitch. The brain does not individually track all the frequencies. Instead, it identifies the dominant spacing between them and labels that spacing as the pitch. This leads to an extraordinary effect called the missing fundamental illusion. If all the lowest frequencies are removed from a sound, if the fundamental frequency is literally absent, the ear still hears the original pitch. This is because the spacing between the remaining harmonics preserves the frequency pattern. The brain reconstructs the missing tone even though it is not physically present. In everyday life, this is why tiny speakers can still appear to produce bass notes they are not capable of generating. The harmonic structure tricks the auditory system into imagining the fundamental. The brain's ability to infer missing information is not a flaw. It's a survival mechanism. In nature, sounds echo, reverberate, and distort. The brain must identify useful signals, despite interference. Illusions highlight how the brain performs this reconstruction. Some illusions arise because the auditory system attempts to group sounds into coherent objects. When frequencies appear related, the brain binds them together. When they appear unrelated, the brain separates them into distinct streams. This is how humans can follow one conversation in a noisy environment, a phenomenon known as the cocktail party effect. The brain filters voices based on pitch, location, and rhythm, grouping one set of sounds as important and relegating others to the background. This grouping mechanism also underlies illusions like octave errors. An octave is a doubling of frequency. If a note at 400 Hz is played along with a note at 200 Hz, the brain treats them as musically identical, even though they belong to different registers. This flexibility is part of how humans identify melodies even when the pitches are shifted. The contour, the rise and fall, matters more than the absolute frequency. If a melody is divided across octaves, the brain reorganizes the fragments into a coherent pattern. But this ability to reorganize sound can also lead to illusions, melodies that appear unchanged even when their structure has been altered, or tonal sequences that sound the same while shifting in ways the ear does not consciously track. One of the most dramatic auditory illusions is the Shepard tone, created from overlapping tones separated by octaves. Each component rises in pitch, but the highest tones fade out while new low tones fade in. The combined effect is a sound that seems to rise forever, like an acoustic escalator that never reaches the top. The illusion works because the brain focuses on the consistent upward motion while ignoring the fading transitions. Although no single tone rises indefinitely, the pattern does, and the brain interprets the pattern rather than the physical reality. This same principle can be applied to melodies. If each note of a tune is shifted to the nearest octave boundary, the overall contour remains, but the melody jumps unpredictably across registers. Yet listeners still recognize the tune. The brain prioritizes the relational movement between notes, up, down, up, rather than the specific pitch. Illusions also arise from how the brain integrates information from multiple senses. One powerful example is the influence of vision on hearing. When the shape of a person's mouth corresponds to one sound but the audio plays another, the brain blends the two, creating a hybrid perception. This effect demonstrates that hearing is not an isolated sense. It depends heavily on inputs from other systems, especially when interpreting speech. Another class of illusions emerges from the brain's tendency to find meaning in noise. When repeating syllables are played rapidly, listeners often report hearing distinct words, sometimes entirely different words depending on expectations and priming. This is called the phantom word illusion. The brain tries to interpret ambiguous sounds based on language patterns, emotional tone, or recent suggestions. Different people often hear different words, reflecting how subjective the interpretation is. Expectation and context shape what the brain hears in real time. If someone is told to listen for a particular word, they are more likely to hear it. If they are told nothing, they may perceive entirely different patterns. These illusions reveal how much the auditory system relies on top-down processing, using knowledge, memory, and prediction to interpret sensory input. Another striking illusion comes from slow interference between two similar frequencies. When tones differ by only a few hertz, they interact to produce a pulsing effect called beating. The brain interprets this as the sound getting louder and softer, even though neither tone actually changes amplitude. The fluctuation is purely a product of interference patterns. When applied separately to the left and right ears, the difference in frequency can create a sensation of internal rhythm or oscillation, an effect known as binaural beating. While often misunderstood or misrepresented, the underlying phenomenon is simply the brain attempting to reconcile slight timing differences in the signals reaching each ear. Sound localization relies on these timing differences. The human brain detects tiny disparities in arrival time between the left and right ears, differences as small as microseconds. It also evaluates differences in loudness, as well as frequency filtering caused by the shape of the outer ear. Together, these cues allow humans to determine where a sound originates. This system works remarkably well, but it is fragile. When researchers fitted participants with the molds that changed the shape of their outer ear, sound localization accuracy collapsed. The brain's learned model no longer matched external reality. But after wearing the altered shape for several weeks, people adapted. Their brains built a new model. When the molds were removed, they needed time to readapt to their original hearing. This adaptability shows how much auditory perception depends on learned experience rather than fixed biological structures. The history of human sound perception includes attempts to amplify sounds over long distances. Before radar, engineers built enormous concrete structures known as acoustic mirrors. These paralock walls could collect faint sounds from aircraft engines miles away. They function like giant ears, focusing sound waves to a central point where listeners could detect approaching planes. These mirrors appeared along coastlines during a period of rapid technological transition. They served as an early warning system before electronic detection became widespread. When radar emerged, the role of these structures became obsolete, but their existence remains a fascinating example of human ingenuity in acoustic detection. Many illusions occur not because the brain is flawed, but because it is efficient. The auditory system must deal with noisy environments, incomplete information, and ambiguous signals. It must infer meaning from vibrations that last only fractions of a second. Illusions arise because the brain uses shortcuts, rules of thumb that work most of the time but can be exploited under special conditions. For example, when a sound abruptly stops, the brain expects continuity. If a noise bursts momentarily interrupt a tone, the brain often fills in the missing piece, perceiving the tone as continuous. This continuity illusion keeps perception stable when real-world sounds are masked by other noises. Similarly, when listening to speech in a loud environment, the brain uses context, expectations, and linguistic knowledge to reconstruct the message. Auditory illusions reveal not weakness, but sophistication with a demonstration how the brain balances bottom-up sensory information with top-down interpretation. The brain does not simply record the world, it constructs it. And in that construction, some interpretations become shortcuts that work remarkably well, until carefully designed sounds expose the cracks. Even in music, illusions shape our experience. Consider harmonic roughness, the sensation that occurs when two tones are slightly out of tune. The resulting interference produces a shimmering texture that musicians use intentionally. Singers and violinists adjust their pitch based on these interference cues, learning to reduce beating when harmonizing. What seems like a simple artistic choice is rooted in deep principles of auditory perception. Understanding illusions also sheds light on how the brain separates sound sources. In a crowded room, people can focus on one voice because the auditory system organizes sound based on frequency, rhythm, and spatial cues. This complex filtering process allows humans to parse overlapping acoustic streams, but illusions show how easily this system can be confused. If voices share similar pitch contours, or if noise masks critical frequencies, separation becomes difficult. Illusions can even reveal hidden symmetries in how the brain represents pitch. Some illusions demonstrate that certain tone relationships are treated as equivalent, regardless of octave. This is why melodies transposed across octaves remain recognizable. The auditory system encodes relative pitch rather than absolute pitch, prioritizing structural relationships over raw data. Perhaps the most fascinating lesson from auditory illusions is how perception adapts. The auditory system constantly updates its internal models based on experience. Exposure to new environments, languages, or soundscapes reshapes these models. Illusions momentarily expose these internal rules, allowing us to glimpse the algorithms the brain uses to interpret the world. These illusions go beyond entertainment. They inform the design of hearing aids, audio engineering, communication technologies, and sound-based user interfaces. Understanding how the brain interprets ambiguous signals helps researchers develop tools that compensate for hearing loss. It shapes virtual environments where sound must be convincing. It guides the creation of warning systems that cut through noise. Auditory illusions are windows into the brain's strategies for navigating an unpredictable world. They highlight the tension between physical reality and perceived reality. They show that hearing, like all forms of perception, is an active process, a construction shaped by biology, experience, and expectation. Humans often think of sound as objective, a vibration at a certain frequency, a waveform traveling through air, but perception transforms those vibrations into meaning. The same physical stimulus can produce entirely different experiences depending on context. Illusions remind us that the brain is not a passive recorder, but an interpreter, constantly making educated guesses. At Mythosium, we explore illusions like these because they reveal the inner workings of the mind. They show how perception is shaped not only by the external world, but by the structure of the brain itself. And they remind us that reality, as experienced, is always a blend of physics and interpretation. If learning how the brain constructs sound, interprets ambiguity, and shapes acoustic reality fascinates you, make sure to subscribe. The world of perception is filled with mysteries, and we're just beginning to explore them. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.